Good morning, everyone. It's Wednesday, March 13th. I know that you are getting up every morning and thinking first about AP World History, going directly to your textbook to do the calendar reading that's listed. I know that that's what's happening. So I thought I would come to you this morning and give you a couple pieces of information, and a couple ideas about some of that reading you've been looking at. And I know that the textbook itself is looking at the period of the rise and fall of communism kind of as a whole. And we had just left last week talking about the rise in the Russian Revolution and then some of the issues that created for World War One, and then for the post-war world, and how the uh, the rise to power of Stalin really also shifted and changed the type of communism in the Soviet Union. Today, because I know your reading is continuing and starting to talk about the People's Republic of China and the communist movement in China, I thought I would give you a couple comparisons between what communism looks like in the Soviet Union and what communism looks like in the People's Republic of China, and how those movements were different in a lot of ways. So, first, let's take a brief look at China. And the Chinese Communist movement rose out of the post World War I period. As early as the late teens, early 1920s, there was a Chinese Communist Party, but the dominant power in China was the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party. And they slowly through the 20s really wanted to get rid of communism in China. So they attacked the Communist Party in China repeatedly, and they forced it out of most cities and into rural areas. And Mao Zedong was the very, very important leader of the Communist Party in China. And Mao organized that Communist Party that remained once they were forced out of the cities in the 1920s. He really organized it with peasants. So Marxism, the idea of Karl Marx, the Chinese didn't know anything about Marxism. I'm not sure how much the Russians knew about Marxism, but at least people in the cities knew about it. And one of the things that Mao was trying to do was introduce communism to peasants. And so he had to kind of make it available to them with language and ideas that they understood. And he was very effective at that. The revolution in China increasingly tried to be a peasant revolution, which is different than obviously in the Soviet Union. As World War II started, it started much earlier in China when Japan invaded parts of China as early as 1937. And part of that World War II struggle against Japan and their fascist aggression was the Chinese people seeing the Communist Party as a nationalist movement. So when the war was over and Japan was defeated, the communists were pretty popular. And in fact, within just a matter of years, by 1949, they defeated the nationalists fully, pushed the nationalists to the island of Formosa, which is today known as Taiwan, and declared the People's Republic of China. So that is a really different type of communist struggle that Marx probably would have never recognized with the idea of a peasant-led revolution. So if we were to compare communism, or so-called communism, in the Soviet Union and in China, we would say that the Russian movement tended to be more urban. Communists were in cities, and it was kind of a traditional urban proletariat. Though we had mentioned earlier that, frankly, most people in Russia weren't paying attention during the Russian Revolution. In China, it was a much more peasant-led communist movement. And so that's certainly a big difference between the two. Both push forward some ideas of equity, but if we're looking at gender, they both had the traditional communist idea of women being equal, but neither of them really fully challenged roles, stereotypical gender roles, and women's status. Didn't substantially change. I think in China it didn't change that much at all. It probably changed more in the Soviet Union than it did in China. And then finally, if we're looking at the end period, then we'll come back and talk more about the Cold War and then the fall of communism later. In Russia, there was political and an economic reform when communism collapsed. While in China, there was a strong economic reform. Both nations today are capitalist, but China did not reform politically. And so they remain a totalitarian nation.